Well, good afternoon for those that have dialed in. And if you could write in the chat where you're actually dialing in from, and also if you know your First Nations country, if you can put that in the chat, that would be great. I'm Jacki Johnson. I'm the Illawarra Shoalhaven City Commissioner of the Greater Cities Commission in New South Wales. I'm also a non-executive director of Community First Bank, but I'm very proudly a PhD candidate here at University of Wollongong, studying how Australian companies can effectively deliver value for all stakeholders, and particularly focused on the environmental and social goals express the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It is a real pleasure to welcome you all here today, and Luminaries is a great concept where it brings together the leading UOW researchers along with industry experts and thought leaders for an hour conversation every 2 weeks. And we're lucky enough today for the topic to be sustainable finance, a very hot topic and that has been evolving very rapidly, particularly in the last 12 months, but I would suggest over the last 10 years. And this brings a really powerful session today with leading researchers who can share their insights. Today we'll be hearing from a group of exceptional researchers from my point of view, because they have been navigating the developments that have been occurring in this space. But before we start, I would like to acknowledge country, and sitting here on Darawal country, Wadi Wadi people. On behalf of the university, I'd like to acknowledge that the country for Aboriginal people is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships that we can all learn from, particularly in the field of sustainable finance. The University of Wollongong itself spreads from Sydney to the Southern Highlands and to the South Coast. So that's from freshwater to bitter water to salt, from city to urban to rural. The University of Wollongong acknowledges the custodianship of the Aboriginal people and that they have kept alive the relationships with all living things, and has taught us a lot about resilience, care for country and care for people. Today, we welcome the thought leaders for a 1-hour conversation to discuss emerging research and driven by initiatives to tackle climate change and promote sustainable development, growing acknowledgement, the critical role finance plays. And when we talk about sustainable finance, we are talking about the finance that will support the transformation that we require across the world, and particularly here in Australia. And that includes debt, equity, and insurance, all coming together to actually secure our future. The panel today will discuss why it is important for finance students and leaders to understand sustainable finance, and that it will help to grow our economic fortunes, very timely given the reports that have been published today on intergenerational future. And that this is a great opportunity for leaders to continue what areas of study they need to continue to have to stay relevant in a changing world. I would like to welcome our guest speaker and panellists today, Professor Millicent Chang, Associate Professor Andrew Ainsworth, and Dr. Searat Ali. We're going to hear from each of them, and then I will pose the first questions, and I would invite you all to be putting questions in the Q&A, so that as we hear from the speakers, at the end of the 3 parts of the discussion, I will then pose your questions to each of the presenters. And Millie is in the hot seat first, so I'm going to throw to her to share her wisdom. Thank you, Millie.
Thank you, Jacki. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and to talk to you about my favorite topic. So if anyone wants to listen, I'm happy to talk about corporate disclosures on climate change. So as you know, climate change has brought about financial risk to economies around the world and has really changed the way businesses operate. So the impact of climate change has manifested itself in risk in terms of rising sea levels, rising temperatures, and also climate policies represent some form of risk, but also opportunities in emerging technologies towards renewable energy. So for you, as you know, for financial markets to operate effectively and efficiently, information, high quality information and really comprehensible information is needed about the impact of climate risks. To aid such disclosure by organizations worldwide, the Financial Stability Board in London created the Task Force on Climate Change-related Disclosures, better known as the TCFD, to increase and improve disclosure about climate-related financial information. Now, the TCFD developed a framework to allow companies to disclose on the risk and opportunities related to climate change. They establish disclosure in 4 categories. Now, this information companies have probably already been providing in different forms, but the form the TCFD framework required was disclosure in governance. That is how firms or management governs the risk and responsibility, the risk and opportunities related to climate change. Strategy, what are their strategies? What are the actual and perceived impact of the risk and opportunities on business operations, on financial planning? Risk management. Now, this is an important one, given we've been talking a lot about the climate risk. So whether companies identify such risk, whether they estimate the risk, and also how they manage the risk. And finally, metrics and targets. So the greenhouse gas emissions here, in terms of scope 1 and scope 2, the direct and indirect emissions, and also scope 3, if possible, the emissions in the supply chain. And also the targets. These organizations have set themselves to reduce the carbon emissions, be it short-term, medium-term, or long-term. Now, the TCFD released its framework in 2017, and since then, in the 2022 status report, we know that 3,800 organizations have signed up to be TCFD supporters. The number in Australia of TCFD supporters is 180. And these organizations are mainly in the financial sector. So they represent banks, insurance companies, superannuation funds, and also asset managed funds, and the mining companies in energy and materials. So in Australia, the first TCFD supporters who signed up in June 2017 was the ANZ Bank, BHP, and Cbus Super. So what do these companies report on in the 4 categories I mentioned previously? So strategy seems to be the area for which companies are reporting extensively, but governance is the area of least disclosure. The reason I've chosen to talk about the TCFD framework is because the International Sustainability Standards Board has chosen the TCFD framework as its basis for the accounting for the standards that have been released. So since then, some countries have required mandatory disclosure under the TCFD framework. And some of these countries are the UK, the European Union, in Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan, and our neighbor, New Zealand. Thus, much of the research we're doing is around looking at why firms voluntarily disclose such climate change related information, because we know that the disclosure of such information comes with costs, be it in giving up the competitive advantage or providing more information than needs to be provided. So from our research, we found that firms with high levels of carbon emissions tend to disclose more. And we believe this is due to an effort to legitimize their emissions. And the categories in which they disclose information is in all three categories except for governance. Now, governance seems to be a sticking point among firms in their disclosure. In other work that we've done, we've also asked the question of who uses this information? Is this information actually used by the market? And we are happy to report that analysts seem to use the information disclosed under the TCFD framework, because for firms who disclose much information in this framework, analysts' forecasts seem to become more accurate, and there is less dispersion in their forecasts. And again, the categories they disclose under are governance. In this case, strategy and risk management seem to drive the reduction in forecast error and dispersion. So I think I'll leave it there for now, Jacki.
Thank you, Millie. And just wrapping up those comments, I think is a good segue to Searat, where you're talking about TCFD being a common framework used across the world and will form the basis of the new accounting standards. But this point about strategically you're positioning your goals, but also then looking at your governance and risk management practices in this evolving area. And certainly the question you're raising is who is using this information, and your research shows that, in fact, analysts are using it to rate your company. So thank you, Millie, and over to Searat.
Thank you so much, Jacki, and thanks, Professor Millie, for sharing your insights. I have set up slides, and I would like to share them with the participants. Okay, can anyone confirm if you can see the PowerPoint slides? Okay, so I'm very excited about my presentation that I have chosen based on my teaching and research I do at University of Wollongong. And the title is in front of you: Sustainable Finance, Who are the Key Players and What are the Key Considerations they look at? Before we look into the main topic that I have chosen, I would like to discuss what are the key risks the global leaders are considering that they will have severe impact in the next 2 years and 10 years. So based on the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, out of 10 risks, 8 risks are related to environment and social. And here comes the role of managing the sustainability risk, because that is linked to environment and social. And if you look at like general audience, whoever they are, if you look at their searches on the Google search, we see a significant increase in the demand of ESG information. And that increase we can notice from 2017 onward, and that aligns with the TCFD framework when it was introduced in 2017. And if you look at what is happening in the practice, in particular in US, we see the ESG and sustainable investments, they have also significantly increased over the period of time. In particular, from 1995, $639 billion to $17.1 trillion in 2020. And we see a significant increase from 2012 onward. Okay, so what is sustainable finance? As we have been talking about, it is the consideration of environmental, social, and governance factors into the investment decision making. And who are the key players that deal with this ESG information? So there are 3 key players. The first is the corporate issuer, then comes the rating agencies, and then the investors. So if our focus is on investors, if investors want to use the ESG information in their investment decision, and this is what sustainable finance is, they have to rely on the disclosure by the corporate issuers. For example, BHP, Commonwealth Bank, any company that issues the bond and equity, what information they are disclosing on those E, S, and G factors. And then investors can directly assess the information, but not all investors have that capability. And then they rely on the rating providers, which have the research team to assess the information related to ESG disclosed by corporate issuers. If you look at the corporate issuers, so they have a choice like voluntary versus mandatory. So some of the jurisdictions have already mandated the disclosure, as Professor Millie was saying, but some of the jurisdictions are still in a process to move away from voluntary to mandatory disclosure. So let's say if we are living in a voluntary disclosure regime, then the company have a choice either to disclose or not to disclose. Let's say if the company decide to disclose, then they have various disclosure frameworks to pick from. So those disclosure frameworks can come from general sustainability, which includes environmental, social, and governance all together. And they can also be linked to specific disclosure, like Professor Millie was highlighting TCFD in particular, that is linked to the climate-related financial disclosure. So now the issue that happens here for investors, like if it is a voluntary regime and companies can pick any of these options, then the issue of comparability of the information for the investor is a big issue. So how they compare and contrast different types of disclosure disclosed by a same company in the same industry. So there is a confusion there. There is an effort going on the standardization of the disclosure frameworks, and you can see a flowchart here, which is highlighting how different frameworks available over the past are coming together, and there is a standardization process happening. So in that front, International Sustainability Standard Board, which was established in 2021 at the COP26, have come up with the general sustainability requirements and the climate-related sustainability requirement. So what's the outcome that we are hoping from this is the comparable, robust, and the verifiable information available to the investors. So then comes the rating providers who assess this information that is being disclosed by the corporate issuers. As it is with the disclosure frameworks, there are many disclosure frameworks, and we are moving towards the standardization. Same is the case for the rating providers. So there are a number of rating providers available. So what they do, they take the input ESG information disclosed by the corporate issuers under different frameworks. They process it based on their rating methodologies, and they give a rating or a score to a corporate issuer. And that score, if investor want to rely upon and want to invest based on ESG beliefs, can be relied upon. For example, Refinitiv, if you look at how their rating come together, this chart shows that picture. And if you look at the bottom, how many data points they are using, 630 data points to come up with one score. And there is a process involved in between. When you look at S&P Global, how they come up with this score, they used 1,000 data points, and they come up with a score that investor can rely upon. And MSCI ESG score have also different data points they pick on environmental, social, and governance factors, and they come up with the rating score that investor can rely. So now if we look at the correlation among the ratings provided by these rating providers, we see the correlation is not that great. So it ranges from 13.9% between S&P Global and ISS to 64.5% between S&P and Sustainalytics. So now what issue it creates? If the rating is not correlated, then the issue of divergence is there. So I'm giving the hypothetical example. Think about a company A. It is rated by provider 1, provider 2, and provider 3. A different rating can come out. Provider 1 is giving high rating, AAA. Provider 2, A rating, slightly lower, and provider 3 is giving much lower rating of B. So now if I'm an investor and I want to invest in company A, is this company doing well on ESG, or is this company not doing well on ESG? There is an issue involved here. So what are the factors that basically cause this divergence? Based on a research that there are 3 factors that cause this divergence. So one of the factors is scope. What rating agencies consider as input, 630 points by Refinitiv or 1,000 points by S&P Global. So what they consider is to be included. And how they measure those 630 data points and 1,000 data points, that's another area that causes the divergence. And how much importance they give to those data points. That's the weighting. But based on the research, most of the divergence comes from measurement, how each data point is measured. And second is the scope, what is considered in coming up the rating, what are the ESG information and data points used, and less of the issue is with the weighting. What is the implication then for the fund managers and investors? Should they rely on ESG ratings or should they not rely on ESG ratings? So my answer to this question is, if the investors have capability, like fund managers, the large institutional managers, what they should do, they should conduct their own research. In particular, for the stocks that have greater divergence, if they do their own research, the future performance of the fund is going to be increased. And this is shown in one of the working paper. So what I see as a next step, with the standardization of the disclosure frameworks happening, more comparable, robust, and verifiable information disclosed by the corporations. That's the first thing. So the rating agencies will have similar information to rely upon, and the artificial intelligence, the machine learning, textual analysis will facilitate in coming up with the measurement and the quantification of the numbers. So I hope that in the next few years, with these advancements, there will be more convergence in ESG rating. So before I conclude, I have few questions that I want to raise. The question is, what can you and I do together to foster sustainability? So we have only two options. The first option is do nothing. Finance as usual. Don't consider E and S factors. They are the top risk, as I have shown in Global Risk Report. Out of 10 risks, 8 risks are linked to environmental and social. Do nothing. They are going to come and eat your returns in the long run. That's a short-term approach if we want to adopt. Second option, do something. And that is sustainable finance. And you don't need to do something bigger at the start. What you can do, you can start with the exclusion. Let's take an example. We are a bond investor. We want to lend money to company A. Company A is in a business of, let's say, fossil fuels, tobacco, weapon. What we can do at a bare minimum, we exclude those companies from lending money. We don't lend money. But the issue in that approach is, if we don't lend money, someone else will lend money because they're still operating in the market. Then what we can do as a next step? Next step is the ESG integration. What does it mean? The company may be poorly performing on gender equality, on renewable energy, on overall ESG, but we lend money to that company, charge higher premium because that company have a risk, material risk that is linked to E, S, and G factor. And if we believe on that, we will charge higher premium. That's the second step. And the benefit of this step is we can engage and vote on the projects of the company if we are shareholder. Otherwise, as a bondholder, we can decide not to give future lending if they don't abide by the covenants that we put forward. And the final optimal step is impact investing, green bonds, and social bonds. We can give lending to the projects and companies that want to achieve the better social and environmental outcomes. For example, affordable housing, or it can be renewable energy projects. So I leave you with a question. What single action you can take to contribute to making the world a better place for everyone? Thank you so much for your listening.
Thank you, Searat. And I think that is a very powerful question for all leaders to be asking themselves as we face into such a changing world. And so I think Searat actually emphasises that this reporting is very dynamic in terms of how it's evolving, and the picture that he put up, the image of the Bloomberg graph of how all the reporting standards are moving and consolidating, which then leads to that standardisation. But with the evolution of AI and then how that will converge the availability of information and how it's used. But I did like the 3 points that he raised. I don't think, Searat, we should encourage people to do nothing, but certainly that point about you can start by thinking about what you don't invest in. And then the second point is, how do you stay involved to create the change? But then the higher order question is, can you make such a difference by how you're investing your money in terms of creating impact on social and environmental? So thank you, Searat. I think that was fantastic how you posed your questions for all of us to think about. And then Andrew, your insights.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie, and thanks to all the participants for joining the webinar today. So I'd like to take the investment perspective on sustainable finance. So Millie talked a lot about the disclosure of climate and sustainability information. And so the reason that is so important, and Searat touched on this as well, is that it's an input into investors' decision-making. And so ultimately that decision-making that investors are trying to understand the risks that companies are facing and where the investor thinks that the share price of that company is going to be going. So if we just take a pure financial view, they're caring about the returns, trying to think about the risks. So we focus first on the performance or the returns that investments generate. And this is one of the sort of the key questions that I think we probably all think about when we look at our superannuation statements or other investments is, how did I perform? And so the key thing with sustainable investing is, does it actually hurt your financial performance? So traditionally, the view has been that if you actually restrict the number of assets that you can invest in, you'll naturally perform. You cannot perform any better than an unrestricted set of assets. And so what sustainable investing does is it actually can restrict that set of assets. But the good news is that this old world view that sustainable investing can't do any better than investing that is agnostic to sustainability. What we've seen is that you can actually do just as well and sometimes even better by taking a sustainable approach to investments. So some research that I've done looking at this issue in the US and the UK has found that the penalty or the cost of being green this century is about 0.6% per annum. So you think, 0.6% per annum, okay, that's something I've got to give up to be green. But that's not the good news. The good news is that this penalty of being green has been disappearing over time. And so as time has gone by, there's actually no penalty for being green and investing sustainably. Obviously, there's a bit of variation over time with volatility in markets. But I think that the point to take out of some of the research I've done on this is that you don't actually have to give up returns to have an impact with your investments. So the other side of the coin in finance, we talk about return, but the other side of that coin is risks. And climate risk is something that is material, is important, and that's obviously why we're talking about, and Millie's talking about the disclosure regimes that are actually coming. So in the research we did, we controlled for volatility, which is kind of the traditional source of risk that we think about. And so if you start to take into account some of these other risks that we know exist, but perhaps we can't really quantify just yet, that equality of performance is actually probably really some outperformance because you're avoiding a lot of the climate risks by investing sustainably. So I think that's kind of the important point to take out. With this disclosure regime, we need to understand what the risks are from an investment point of view so we can build portfolios that are going to have longevity, because we really don't know the horizon over which a lot of these climate risks are going to manifest. We know that they're there, but we're not really sure how they're going to present themselves. So I think that's a really important point to take out of everything. When you're looking at your superannuation statement and you're looking at the returns that have generated, you've also got to have in the back of your mind, well, what are the risks that are in my portfolio? So I think another thing that's worth pointing out in this space is it's not just about risks that are driving returns. Investor preferences are really important. And so Searat shared a chart earlier that showed the growth in assets under management in sustainable investments. And I think that has been a real big trend that has actually led to a change in markets, and that demand has actually started to push up the share prices of stocks that are actually, or companies that have a sustainable approach. So I think the point there, when we think about the preferences and the impact on the market, perhaps we have, certain investors, maybe we all know someone who has this view that says, I don't care about sustainability. I'm going to invest in coal stocks because if no one else is, I'm going to get all these great returns. But I think that the point is that if everyone in the market is starting to change how they invest and how they view these risks, returns and stock prices are going to actually be impacted. So I think that's what's already happening now. And so even if you're someone who's a climate denier, your investments are already factoring in this risk. So if you're going to ignore a risk that is present in share prices, well, I think that's a pretty silly way to manage a portfolio. So I think that's kind of the point that I would leave everyone. So even if you just care about the financial return, you've still got to care about what's happening with climate risk, modern slavery risk, and all of these things, because they will impact the return.
Thank you, Andrew. And I like the framing around return and risk, because one of the things that I think we have to be reminded too, and Millie talked about how the banks were the first to adopt TCFD along with the mining, but the banks and the insurers have been directed by their regulator, by APRA. And so what we end up with is some regulatory risk as well, which will then drive the way products will get priced, because it will have to be put into the risk equation of the banks and the insurers if they've got higher exposures than others on their balance sheet. So it particularly resonated for me, having had an insurance and a banking background. I would encourage everyone to put some questions on the Q&A, and I will frame them for each of our speakers. And there is so much food for thought, but I might kick off on a question to Millie. You talked about the way information is presented. I'm really interested in your view about the information that gets presented by management in the reports, but the information that might not get presented, so the omissions, if you like, and how that is then treated by the market in your view, and what will investors need to do to make sure they get that level of transparency that they need to be able to have that reliability of their ratings.
Okay, thanks, Jacki. Yeah, it's a very important question, because while I mentioned that we have the framework and the disclosure is required or voluntarily at this stage for Australian companies, we find that this information is very hard to navigate for your regular investors. So how do you know that if they have a strategy in place to reduce emissions, or when does the return start happening from this strategy, or how they manage the risk? It's very difficult for investors to consolidate that information that is being provided and to act on the information. And then the question of exclusions, now it's again in a voluntary space that is also very difficult. So what we found from our research is that companies try to differentiate themselves by signing up to be TCFD supporters, and it was not just a signal. They actually provided better information or disclose more information about their climate risk and opportunities. And and we saw higher returns in another study that we did for the TCFD supporting firms. So this means that what they disclose is meaningful. It's found to be meaningful by both analysts and the market. And this resulted in higher returns for these firms.
Thank you, Millie. And just leading on from that, you talked about the difference between voluntary and mandatory reporting. And as you pointed out in your presentation, across the ditch, we do have New Zealand who have mandatory reporting. And we do have a consultation paper out at the moment from our Federal Treasurer. I mean, your view on how mandatory reporting may evolve in this market?
I think the writing is on the wall. It will. I was looking at the timeline for the reporting, and of course they're starting with in the timeline starting with the largest companies, and that's the way it should be, and hopefully, you know, in the timeline by 2027 we will have much more information out there. But I come home to the point of, yes, there will be disclosure, and there will probably be too much disclosure at that stage, but I'm concerned that we will have, we may have too much disclosure, or disclosure that is not comprehensible by your investors. So there will still need to be reliance on the professional investors and the informed investors to interpret the information that has been presented. And again, while there is some standardization, I think the assurance of this information that's being provided is going to be very helpful. So, and perhaps we can think of it as an audit on the disclosed information.
So, and I might hold that point to make a question if we don't get a few other questions, because what I'd like you to think about is then, will there be enough assurers and auditors in the market? And then what do we need to encourage people to do on skill development? And we might come back to skill development as a theme of questioning. Searat, I'm interested in your view about the financial stability, and financial materiality of what you were talking about. I still have an image of all those reporting standards that you put up on the slide, and GRI has encouraged people to think about materiality in a much broader way than financial materiality, but stakeholder impact. And then the accounting standards that are consolidating an approach, very much using financial materiality. In your research and your thinking, how is all this work helping think about financial stability or instability?
Yeah, thanks, Jacki. This is very timely and important question that we all are grappling about from last few years, and it is still continuing with us, and it required discussion. And thanks for asking that question to foster that discussion. In my research, what I have investigated, I took the climate risk perspective, and I have shown in a couple of my papers that if there is a climate risk in terms of physical risk in a particular area, how does it affect the stability of the business? So what I mean by this, in one of my working paper, what I have explored is, if the firm is headquartered in a particular state in US, and that state is more prone to natural disasters, like frequency of natural disasters are more in that particular state, what impact it causes for the firm stability in that particular state. And we have shown that more natural disaster happening in a state where firm has a headquarter have increased default risk, means less stability. So then it shows that the natural disasters have a material impact. Then how do that information is used by the financial institutions? We have shown in that research that if the firms are exposed to higher default risk in states where the headquarters is located and more natural disaster happens, the financial institutions, in particular banks, when they give lending to those firms, they charge higher premium. So that's the cost for the businesses. So in the future, they have to then take some actions to address the climate issue, because if they don't address as a collectively, then those natural disasters are going to keep happening, increase the default risk, and increase the cost of borrowing. So that's an important research that we have done. On the sideline, I have also done research on extreme heat waves, and one of my co-authors is Professor Millie. So how extreme heat waves affect the financial performance of the companies, and we have found interesting result that shows that the extreme heat waves have a material impact. What we have found is, if the company's production or the plant or factory location is in an area which is exposed to extreme heat waves, those firms experience reduction in the firm profitability. And it is through the labor productivity loss, increased in the energy consumption, and increase in the depreciation charges. So this research clearly shows that the financial, the climate risk, physical risk, including natural disaster and heat waves, have material impact on the stability of the business.
Thank you, Searat. And I would imagine if you play that scenario out that you talked about with your research in the US, in terms of then a higher cost of capital because of your risk, if you've just been through a natural disaster, your balance sheet and your P&L is probably the least able to respond to those additional costs and stay competitive. So I think that gives us a lot of food for thought about how you then have to investigate your investment in resilience as well as just mitigating climate change itself. So thank you. Do you have a view on the question I'd asked Millie about the mandatory reporting and your prediction for how that will evolve here in Australia?
I think mandatory reporting is a good step. I appreciate that is happening, because if our neighbors can have it, different countries in Asia can have it, different countries in Europe can have it. In Australia, from where we belong, it's our land, we should have the mandatory reporting. And we have experience in 2019, and I think it was December, where one day in Wollongong, we experienced the sky was completely dark. And it was because of the bushfire. So, and that is because of the, we are not taking adequate actions to tackle climate issues as companies, as investors, and as a collective stakeholders in the community. So I take it as a very positive step, and I appreciate the Treasury taking the lead on that and consulting with the wider stakeholders. And I also appreciate the staggered approach, where the mandatory reporting will start with the larger firms, and then it will move on to the medium-scaled firms, and then it will go to the smaller firms. And by 2027, 2028 period, we will have much of the internal capabilities developed, lessons learned, and then we will see a brighter future.
Thank you, Searat. And I think that's a very good point about the learning effect, that the larger companies with more resources then take the load of the learning, and that gives the time. And I think it was Millie were talking about scope 1, 2, and 3. And just as you're speaking, Searat, I'm thinking, well, the larger firms then take the learning for scope 1, 2, but they will also then start engaging on scope 3, where a lot of the medium and smaller firms will be the suppliers of those firms, and then we'll get hopefully some learning dynamics. So I think both of you have raised a very important point about how that framework works to be able to get to that point. So thank you for that. Now, Andrew, I'm very interested in your views on a few things, because you were talking about, well, let's think about our own superannuation, which raises a question about investors aren't just this homogeneous group of investors that all think the same. So the first question is, what's the difference that you see across the investment market on the use of this information? But also you talked about us all being investors because we have superannuation. I mean, how conscious do you think the Australian public are about the risks that sit within their super? And are we seeing a change where people are taking a more engaged view? And I would encourage more people to put some questions in, and I will get through all the questions as Andrew answers that one. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, no worries, Jackie. Yeah, so I think really what we're seeing is, you know, I talked earlier about preferences. And so, you know, in superannuation, there's the products that we can choose to invest in. We have choice of fund, and even within that choice of fund, we have choice of investment option. And one of the things that we've seen a lot of superannuation funds start to offer is a sustainable investment option that people can choose. And so I think that's you know, catering to investor preferences on one side. But then it's also the risk side that, you know, I alluded to before. And so you can, you know, we can all go and look at the performance of these different options and see how they perform. But when it comes to risk, we know that these climate risks are going to be material. And so superannuation funds are actually changing how they invest. And I suppose in some ways, you know, a bigger picture point here is we talk here about sustainable finance. Maybe in 5 years, sustainable finance is just the same as finance, and we don't have a special term for it. It's just what we do. And, you know, my view is that is where we will head, because if it's affecting returns, it's affecting risk, then that'll just be how business is done. And that'll be a good thing, because it'll be part of normal course of things. So, superannuation funds, a couple of things that they're doing, Searat mentioned about excluding certain stocks from the portfolio if they're involved in, say, for example, tobacco and other industries. But I think where the future is getting superannuation funds is, the biggest investors in the Australian market really engaging with corporate managers and engaging with companies to help them transition their businesses and transform their businesses to make them resilient to climate change. And I think that sort of shareholder activism and engagement that superannuation funds are engaging is a good thing, right? Because it's reflecting their concern, the preferences of their superannuation members, especially those that are in those sustainable investment options. But even, as I sort of mentioned a few times, all their members, because this is a real risk that we're all facing. So, I feel like superannuation funds are doing some are probably better than others, but, they are doing a good job of engaging and trying to push these issues to the fore. And obviously, being an academic and a member of UniSuper, I know that they're a real positive force in this area. They're putting out a lot of climate risk reports, a lot of disclosure. So we talk about disclosure at the corporate level. I think we also need a lot of disclosure at the superannuation fund level, because we all have superannuation and we all have choice of fund. And so we should be able to move our capital, our investments, to a fund that aligns with our values and our views. And so more disclosure from superannuation funds, I think, would be a good thing. And perhaps that's something APRA is looking into. But I think, the other point I'll just sort of finish off on superannuation funds is, the last few years, APRA has had this performance test that they've introduced. And if you fail the performance test, you need to merge with another fund or, wind up your business. So it's a big stick that APRA is holding to the super funds. And so if you've got superannuation funds that are ignoring some of these climate risks, and we know that's going to flow through to performance, well, then down the track, they're probably not a superannuation fund you want to be invested in, because they're probably going to be the ones that are going to underperform and get wound up if they don't take, a lot of these climate issues seriously. So I think that's probably my thoughts on sort of the superannuation and its relation to sustainability. I don't know if that answered your questions, Jacki, but
yeah, and I've got another one that's come through chat that's got a bit of a flavour of the customer demographic as well, about what's the connection. The question in the chat is, what's the connection between different customer demographics and their demand for sustainable finance? And do you have a view? And then I'll come to Searat and Millie on the same question.
I haven't seen anything specific about this in the research that I've read. My feeling is that I wouldn't see why this wouldn't be a broad issue, because we all have different views, different preferences, no matter what demographic we're in. I think we could probably say a lot of the younger people maybe care more about it, but then on the other hand, a lot of the people that are older, been working for a longer time, have larger superannuation balances. So there's a difference between sort of the number of investors and the amount of capital that sort of is interested in this. And it wouldn't take too many, older investors with large superannuation balances to have an interest in this to be equal to, a large number of younger investors with smaller super balances. So I don't really have an answer there, but my feeling is that it would be broad across the demographics.
Yeah, and I think you raise an important point that it's not just the demographics about what they might be looking at. So they might look at climate, but there might be other social issues. You're mentioning about the superannuation funds and their actions. With Rio Tinto, it was the superannuation funds that rallied the pension funds around the world to take action against their board after the Duke and Gorge incident. And so I think your point about the activism, and it might not be necessarily playing out across demographics, it might be particular issues. My own research, just one of the things that came up by one of the stakeholders I interviewed, who is on a super board, said the reality is, if you're breaching human rights, such as he was talking about blueberries and Woolworths and Coles and in their supply chain, and if they've got people living in shipping containers and you're happy to buy your berries for $3 a punnet, there doesn't seem to be a demographic shift across that group of what people are willing to pay, because they actually want the berries at that price and they're willing to walk past what might happen. And so even if they're reporting that in their investment reports as the super fund, they're not seeing their members wanting to take action, but they are on climate. So I think that reinforces your point that there might be topics that change over a period of time about social acceptance. Searat, do you have a view on the demographic question that the person in the chat has asked?
Yeah, definitely. So demographics, I think it requires further research to look at the sustainable funds who is investing. But looking at my research on gender and age in particular, so I do see female directors when it comes to companies. They take more initiatives when it comes to the sustainable future. Like, for example, investing in renewable energy, reducing the carbon emissions. Research in Journal of Corporate Finance, which I have read, have shown that more females sitting on the board can contribute towards the transition from fossil fuel towards renewable energy. So taking that, I do see that demographic playing a crucial role in achieving the sustainability, like female demographics. And I think we should promote those females to really come up front and join the hands with other like males to push that change together. So I think it leads towards the inclusive culture as well. And I do see the young people, because they are more exposed to the education they are receiving on the sustainability and more engagement with the artificial intelligence, the internet. So they have more exposure that is happening just recently, and they're developing their beliefs in that environment, their attitude in that environment. Whereas the older people, they can also be part of the change, but I think it requires a change in their attitude and perception, which requires some incentives and push to make that happen.
Thank you. And Millie, your view on the demographic question?
Not too much more to add, Jackie, but just wanted to link your example of the blueberries at $3 a punnet to the global risk that Searat put up, where the number one concern was the cost of living crisis. So that plays a role in the choices we make.
Yes, it's a good point. Another question in the chat is, what is the view of the panel on excluding certain sectors that we know are doing harm, such as mining and petroleum? Should there just be exclusions across the market? Starting with you, Millie. My light's gone out, so I'll just switch the light on while you answer that question.
I suppose yes, there's an energy, in addition to the cost of living crisis, there's an energy crisis which adds to the cost of living. So I suppose it's we know that mining companies such as BHP and others are taking steps to reduce the mining of fossil fuels, and this brings about another problem for the stranded assets that are these companies hold. But in terms of investment, again, it has to be a measured approach because I don't think as investors want to punish these types of companies, because they are still employing a large portion of the population, and it's someone's livelihood that's involved here. So again, a measured approach to reducing the investments in this what used to be called the sin stock, and now we include fossil fuels in this sin stock. Yeah.
Thank you, Millie. And I think that's a good point about transition risk. But Searat, I'm interested in your view, because you did raise that in your three choices about you could move to just being excluding certain sectors. Your view on that question that's come up in the chat about excluding petroleum and some mining?
First of all, I would like to support what Professor Millie just mentioned. Just transition is needed, where we take care of everyone involved in that transition, including the employees, the business, and all stakeholders. So I do see exclusion is a good starting point, but it's not the optimal solution, because as I mentioned in my talk, that if you don't give financing to the companies involved in this business, then someone else is going to give money. So they're still having that business going on. But in the long run, the climate is going to affect those businesses, but in the short run, they're still there. So what I see more important is the ESG integration and impact investing. We need to move towards those steps. In ESG investing, there is an approach the investors can adopt is value driver adjustment, where we look at what are the important and material issues a particular industry is facing, and then you look at how your company that you want to invest in is performing also on those issues. And then you see whether the company have a competitive advantage or competitive disadvantage. Based on that analysis, you can then adjust the value drivers like the profit margin, the sales, the cost of capital, and then you can give a value that you can trade upon. And if you decide to invest in a company that have competitive disadvantage, you have an option of engagement. And if you have a large investor like Mark Cannon-Brook did for AGL, if you're an investor like that, you stay with the company and drive a change. So I like that approach. But starting point exclusion serves a starting point, but we need to move on to integration and impact investing.
We've got 3 minutes to go, and what I'd like each of you to wrap up on is what you think the opportunities are for skill development, and if you were really promoting what skills leaders should be taking for this space. So a bit of a plug for sustainable finance skills. Millie.
I come back to the assurance of the disclosures, because more and more we're finding that companies tend to under-disclose perhaps their emissions, and so there needs to be assurance of the emissions, both Scope 1 and 2 more directly, and then in the Scope 3 area.
Thank you. Searat, your view on skills for the future?
I think my views are there. Definitely, I want to contribute on that. If you think about a world prior to 2015, there used to be a time where financial risk used to be very important and the most important. But if you look at the global risk report that I shared, post 2015, the social and environmental risk have become important. So this tells us a story that anyone who have done education before 2015 might not have studied sustainable, including social and environmental risk, because education, the universities were less focused there because the demand was not there. The demand was financial training when it comes to the financial graduates. But post 2015, Sustainable Development Goals hit, Paris Agreement hit, and we are seeing more and more disasters happening. The climate risk is increasing. So now if someone have received education before that time and now working in the industry, need to get up to the social and environmental risk. And what are the options available? The options are do some micro-credentials, get back to the universities, could do applied, do graduate certificates, like University of Wollongong offers graduate certificate in applied finance, and we do have a course on a subject on socially responsible finance. So the options like that are available to the existing professionals, and they can join the professional associations, do like CFA, ESG specialization course, or CFI, Corporate Financial Institute. They have this ESG specialization course, and they can join the networks like the Global Impact Investing Network, the UN Principle for Responsible Investment, to get involved in the training and continuous professional development. So these are the options with existing professionals. For new entrants, they are lucky. They are receiving the trainings at universities like University of Wollongong, and we hope that they will be better prepared for the future.
Thank you, Searat. And Andrew, your closing comments on skill development in this space?
Yeah, I think what really needs to happen is it needs to be broad-based. So we need people who understand the climate science and some of those, those really technical issues need to be able to communicate with the people working in finance. So we need both groups of people to have the understanding so that they can communicate with each other. And I think, talking to a former student who in industry, and he relayed to me that, he works in funds management, and it's kind of like, it's really hard for them to get on the same page, the ESG team, and the investment team. And so I think that to me is, is really important. So, starting out, as I think Searat hit the nail on the head, starting out, learning about this, early in your degree, and sort of taking those skills, through your degree and into your your work life, and then also topping up those skills, coming back and learning about all these recent developments, I think is really important, so that we can all speak the same language, and hopefully, as I alluded to earlier, that'll be what happens. It'll just be, that's how business done. There is no sustainable finance. That just becomes normal finance.
That's a great note to finish on, Andrew, that should be our vision for all of us to work towards. So a big thank you to Millie, Searat and Andrew for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to everyone who dialed in on this very important topic. And we hope you enjoyed the discussion, and some of the chat comments say that people found it very valuable. So thank you. This event has been recorded and will be distributed to everyone who registered. And thank you again, and good evening. Thank you, everyone.